I'll let you throw it at her. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. I was wondering what you were doing in Amos.
That was the text you sent me a few weeks ago.
Well, he's next. He's next week. We flip that light switch.
Our garage is connected to the house, and he wanted to go between them. I'm like, no, you're not going to go. I put my feet up, and he went, and I landed
Perfect.
on concrete. That was a dumb thing to do.
That is perfect unless somebody else walks in. Okie dokie. We're keeping on doing what we've been doing until somebody says otherwise. You know, if something comes up in one way or another, and you want to, something comes to mind that you really would like to look at, we can always take a Wednesday off of this and look at that and then come back. So just keep that in mind, I guess. Hadn't really occurred to me until just now. But until then, we're going to keep going. Tonight we're going to look at Ahaz. Last week we looked at Ahab. Now we're going to look at Ahaz and a man named Ahithophel. Ahaz was, like Ahab, one of the kings of the divided kingdom, only he was one of the kings of Judah, not one of the kings of Israel like Ahab was. He was the 12th king of Judah, to be exact. He was the son and successor of Jotham. His name means possessor or possibly sustains. It's the shortened form of Jehoahaz. And I did not include the reference. Probably in Chronicles he's called Jehoahaz if I was going to guess. But he is called Jehoahaz. Usually he's called Ahaz. So if you think about Ahaz meaning possessor or sustains, that Jeho on the beginning of the name is the same thing as an IAH at the end of a name, as I've said before, which means Jehovah's in the name. So Jehoahaz just means, you just add Jehovah to whatever the rest of the name means, in this case sustains. So Jehovah sustains or possesses. Again, 12th king of Judah. He was, according to this writer, Albert Barnes, the worst of all the kings of Judah. He imitated the worst of the Israelite kings, Ahab and Ahaziah, by a reintroduction of the Baal worship, which had been rooted out by Israel by Jehu, and out of Judah by Jehoiada. So, like we said, Ahaz was the king of Judah. Here's a little. This is the divided kingdom era. Syria's up there. Then we have Assyria. Syria and Assyria are not the same thing. Syria is a country that still exists today, at least in name. Assyria, not so much. Assyria doesn't fall on this map, but they are that big, huge kingdom. If you think about the kingdom that we looked at of Ahasuerus in the time of Esther, the Assyrian Empire wasn't that big by quite a bit, but it was large compared to these places. And they were the big dog on top. at this time in Israelite history. This is before the Babylonians took over the Assyrians. So the northern kingdom of Israel would be taken over, would be destroyed by Assyria, though they would not take over Judah. Judah would survive until later, and then Babylonia would come in, which is pretty much the same thing as Assyria as far as they were concerned. But Assyria plays a role in the reign of Ahaz, which lasted 20 years. Some things about Ahaz, probably most notably that we can notice, is verse 2. 2 Kings 16 verse 2 tells us, Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned, 16 years, 20 total, after 4 years of co-reigning, if you will. He did not do what was right in the eyes of Jehovah his God, as his father David had done, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom Jehovah drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. There's Ahaz right there. You don't have to learn anything else about Ahaz to know how wicked and absolutely depraved, sickening individual. When it says he burned his son as an offering, that means he burned him alive. He killed him. He sacrificed his son to Molech, the god who took pleasure in child sacrifice, which was done on many occasions in a place called the Valley of Hinnom, which is what these last two pictures have been. The Valley of Hinnom. It's this valley outside of Jerusalem, which is a very significant place in the Bible. And has some connection to the word Gehenna. Anybody know what the word Gehenna means? Hell. I can't recall exactly what the connection is, but there is some sort of linguistic connection. Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, and Gehenna. And it's basically would come to be eventually a garbage dump of Jerusalem. And in this time, in ancient times that is, it was notorious for child sacrifice. This is the place where they would go. The Valley of Hinnom was pretty much synonymous with idolatrous Baal worship, Molech worship, offering children to the gods. And Ahaz, it says, did that. He did this.
How do they come up with this stuff anyway?
What stuff? Offering children?
Yes. Why would you even think of such a creepy awful thing?
Well, I guess, I don't know how they came up with it as far as Molech. Molech was not real. Somebody made him up. So I guess if you make the god up, you get to make up what he likes. And some sick freak came up with the idea that Molech likes you to kill your children.
People are stupid enough to do it. I don't understand how you could do that.
Just depraved humanity is what it is. And, it's not like Molech had ever done anything for them because he's nothing. So there's really no sense in it whatsoever. There's nothing no way to explain it rationally because it's totally irrational. But Ahaz is the man who rejected a message of hope. That's what the author of the book here, how he describes him. Really, those 3 verses that we looked at sum him up just perfectly. But it says he pursued the religious policy of Jehoram, 2 Kings 8, and Ahaziah and Joash. Religious vices were possible because of a corrupt church and a corrupt state. So whenever those 2 things are factors in a government, there's really no limit of what can end up happening, like offering your children as sacrifices to a false god. He rejected David's way in favor of Jeroboam's way. Anybody remember the repeated phrase of Jeroboam? What's Jeroboam's legacy? It'll be a long time before we get to Jeroboam in this list. Yes, go ahead.
I wouldn't say that, but there are a lot of cults today, and like 20, 30 years ago, that the women gave their young daughters to the leader of the cult for sexual toys.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and then people ended up murdering themselves along with the cult leader. So it's not that we're any different now, but
Yeah.
the evil was back then.
Humanity is still depraved, still easily impressionable for evil. It's just one of those things that's a head scratcher about human nature, as we call it, is why people seem to be so much more easily influenced to do evil than to do good and right. The truth. Man just does not want to accept truth. Yeah.
Why is that any worse than killing 62 million babies? That's what our country has.
Yeah, it's not any worse. It's about 62 million times worse. That would be 62 million times worse than.
We're supposed to be civilized.
What's that?
We're supposed to be civilized.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we are. Don't you know that? That's what civilized people do, is kill babies. That's what they'd have you believe. It's way less civilized to try to tell a woman not to kill her baby than it is to let her. So that right there is a perfect example of how depraved humanity can get. But it's no different than it was in the ancient days. Isaiah said, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." That's exactly what we got going on in our culture. So
It said many of the kings were said to have made Israel sin.
yeah,
As Jeroboam.
yeah, that was Jeroboam. That was his legacy. His epithet or whatever on his tombstone could have been "made Israel to sin," because that's how the Bible describes in the Old Testament. Something like 20 or 21 times it says Jeroboam made Israel to sin. I went through and marked them on the opening of here, the section with Ahaz has number 18, 19. Looks like numbers 18 and 19 of the times when it says Jeroboam made Israel to sin. 17, 18, 19. So that's the way Ahaz went, was the way of Jeroboam. And he may have taken it even to another level. So one little thing to point out is when his reign began. It says, according to 2 Chronicles 25, according to 2 Kings 20, and the case is made that if his reign started when he was at 20, that would mean that he died at age 36. But when he died, his son Hezekiah took his place at age 25, which would mean Ahaz had Hezekiah when he was 11. So that's probably not the number to go with as far as between Chronicles and Kings. 25, however, would have made him 16, and a 16-year-old, as we all know, can have a child. Not that abnormal. 11-year-old, not really likely. So if you ever run across the fact that 2 Chronicles 28 says that he started at 25, and 2 Kings says he started at age 20, 25 is probably the more accurate. And there's probably that 4 to 5 year period where he reigned. It was more of a co-regency until he got older, which is where we get the number 20 years total for his reign, including that period. So Ahaz, again, he made sacrifices on the high places. He was an idolater. I mean, he reopened idolatry in a sense to the nation of Judah, in Judah. Just a little historical background. Pekah, who was the king of Israel at the time, and Rezin, the king of Syria, were in league against Judah. Israel and Judah were never friends, except that little strange period last week that we looked at with Ahab and Jehoshaphat, and they got together and said, hey, you want to fight against Syria? Well, at this time, Syria and Israel are fighting, they're in, cahoots together, fighting against Judah. And Ahaz, the king of Judah, he did the worst thing he could have possibly done. Whether you consider it militarily, diplomatically, spiritually, he called on Assyria. Save us. Assyria. Now, he had somebody else he could have called on. He could have called on Jehovah, as his name would indicate. Ironically, Jehovah, he whom Jehovah sustains. Apparently, he didn't sustain him. He wanted Assyria to help. So he called the Assyrian king, not on the phone, obviously. He sent him a letter. I don't know what he did. He got a hold of him somehow. And he said, hey, we want you to come and help us, save us, rescue us. I'm your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel who are attacking me. Then he took a bunch of the silver and gold from the temple and sent it to him as a present to appease him. Treasures of the temple. So now what he has done, he has signed this contract, if you will, and made Judah officially a vassal state of Assyria. A vassal state just means they own them now. They're not an independent nation, strictly speaking. They are owned by Assyria. And that's what would end up happening later on after the Babylonian captivity to this very day, because the nation of Israel as existed in the Old Testament doesn't exist anymore. Israel never again became an independent nation, ever. Not in Jesus' day, not in the days of Malachi or Zechariah or Ezra and Nehemiah, not in the days of the latter part of Jeremiah's ministry, not in Daniel's day. All that time, for the rest of their existence as a nation, they were a vassal state of some nation. Assyria, Babylon, or Babylonia, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then they stopped existing in the days of the Roman kings. So now Ahaz has made Judah a vassal state of Assyria, and Assyria is not in their favor. But they would have no military power now except whatever the Assyrians would let them have. And that's scary. Because what if they didn't want them to have any military power? Then what are they going to do? Except die, and, that's pretty much it. So, 2 Chronicles 28:20 says, Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Syria, came against Ahaz and afflicted him instead of strengthening him. Surprise, surprise. It says, while at Damascus, Ahaz adopted the pattern of a heathen altar and had one built in Jerusalem. That's what we read here. King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a model of the altar and its pattern exact in all its details, an altar that was at Damascus, mind you, which Ahaz, any king of Judah, shouldn't want anything to do with it, any kind of altar that's at Damascus, capital of Syria. The altar of Jehovah is the one he ought to care about. But they adopted this heathen altar, and he built one in Jerusalem. So he offered upon that altar. He closed the temple, removed the utensils, raised shrines to heathen deities all over the place. When he died, nobody really cared. It's harsh, but sometimes the truth is harsh. So Isaiah's first evangelistic announcement in the promise of Emmanuel was made to King Ahaz, interestingly enough. Anybody know who Emmanuel is? Jesus. His name would be Emmanuel, God with us. So that's chapter 7 of Isaiah. He sent a message to Ahaz, a terrified Ahaz, shaking in his boots, that he would not turn to God, but he wouldn't turn to God and trust in his deliverance. He turned to Assyria instead, as we already pointed out. Lack of faith all over the place. Just to turn to that and look at it. Isaiah chapter 7. Whoops. What was it here? Isaiah 7. In the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Syria and Israel came to Jerusalem to wage war against it. Now it says, Jehovah said to Isaiah, "Go out to meet Ahaz at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway of the washer's field. Say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah, because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, it shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years Ephraim will be shattered from being a people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. And then he says to Ahaz, ask a sign of Jehovah your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put Jehovah to the test. He said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. There it is. This was all in this context of this stressful time when Syria and Israel was coming against Judah, and Ahaz, who had a reputation, it seems, for acting a fool, had a message from Isaiah, from God, I should say, delivered through Isaiah, and he was not interested, it seems, in receiving this message of hope even, and instead he puts his faith in Assyria. Very similar to where we are in our journey through the Bible, with the people had Jehovah as their king, but they didn't put their faith in him. They wanted a human king. Maybe because he was tangible, they could see him, they could speak to him face to face and whatnot. Whatever the reason, they chose man instead of God. And anytime you choose man instead of God, you're going to end up in disaster or disappointment at the very least. That's what Ahaz did. Rejected that message. Forfeited his soul. This quote says, Ahaz, apostate from the Mosaic faith and lacking both courage and ingenuity, did not shrink from breaking Mosaic law to seek help from foreign kings, and what turned out to be the ultimate disaster, from foreign gods as well. And all of this happened really because Judah had forsaken the God of their fathers, and their king helped them do that. The king could have had been a force for good and returning the people to Jehovah instead of giving the example of going after false gods and seeking help from either them or from some other nation. And one of the most repeated things that Jeremiah told Judah, the kings of Judah, was don't go to Egypt. Because when we fast forward to Jeremiah's ministry, and some of that was even to Hezekiah, his son, Ahaz, the son of Ahaz, or might have to check that. At any rate, Egypt was what Assyria was at this time. So here we got Syria and Israel. Well, let's get help from the big dog, Assyria. In Jeremiah's day, it was Babylonia coming up against them, so let's get help from Egypt. And God told them over and over, don't go to Egypt, don't go to Egypt, either physically or for help. You will die if you do that. And guess what they did? They went to Egypt. They even dragged Jeremiah there with them. It's one of the most ironic and tragic turns in Jeremiah's ministry, is God told him to tell them over and over, don't go to Egypt. They went anyway, and they dragged him with them. So he went to Egypt himself because they forced. Ahaz is doing the exact same thing except with Assyria instead, and that ended in disaster. He could have accepted the counsel. He could have accepted the message of hope, but he stayed the course, and his life ended in destruction. Unlamented. Not a good king, to say the least. All right, thoughts, comments on Ahaz, which we'll see a lesson from his life, a lesson or two, I guess, from his life at the end there. We can move on to Ahithophel. His name is more fun to say anyway. Means brother of folly, or my brother is foolish, according to one translation. Some things we know about this guy. Have you ever heard of Ahithophel before? You may not have. He's not a very popular character. He didn't do a whole lot as far as the big picture is concerned, but he's interesting. Yes, it seems it's at least possible that he was Bathsheba's grandfather, which would make him David's grandfather-in-law. It's not certain, but it is possible based on, 2 Samuel 11:3 and 23:34. He was a Gilonite, which means an inhabitant of Gilo. He was David's chief advisor or counselor, father of one of David's mighty men, and like we said, possibly Bathsheba's grandfather. He was a man who was noted for his advice. You ever had somebody in your life that they are the person that you would want to go to if you could choose anybody? Like on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? When you have that phone a friend, who you're going to call, you have that person. Like, that's the person I want to call if I'm ever on that show, if it even is a show anymore. They're the person that I want to call because they know all this weird kind of stuff. But what about a person who that's who you would go to for advice about anything? Well, that person is who you would go to, but think about there being a person whose counsel was considered to be pretty much gospel by everybody. Well, that would be Ahithophel. And that is the legacy of Ahithophel. It's we could find that in, chapter 16, 2 Samuel now. No, not, yes. 17. I feel like it's chapter 16, verse 23. Yes. 2 Samuel 16, 23. In those days, the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed, both by David and by Absalom. Now, to properly understand about Ahithophel, we have to back up a little bit to Absalom, which we've looked at Absalom already. He was David's son. He was the brother of Tamar, who was violated, raped by her half-brother Amnon, who was later killed by Absalom 2 years later in revenge, because David didn't do anything about it. Well, Absalom's rebellion or downward spiral would continue to the point where he was going to usurp David's throne. So that's what he's done. he is in the process of usurping the throne, and it says Absalom. Remember, Absalom was a handsome guy. The one with the hair, right? He's the hair man. That was Absalom, right? All these A names, and maybe going in alphabetical order was not a good idea because they're all blending into one person at this point, in my mind. But he was, I believe, he's one of the 5 men in the Old Testament in the Bible that are said to have been a handsome guy. But in addition to being handsome, he was apparently very charismatic and had a magnetic type personality. It says he used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate, where people be coming in, talking, hanging out. When any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there's no man designated by the king to hear you. Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I'd give him justice." Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. See, he's playing his cards he's up to no good. He's stealing the hearts. Who's he stealing the hearts from? David, his dad, who is the king. Absalom, he's winning everybody over. Okay, well, it says at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram, saying, if Jehovah will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, I'll offer worship to Jehovah." But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron." He asked his dad if he can go somewhere. But really what he was doing was working this conspiracy to be proclaimed as the king, the new king, even though his dad was the king. But somebody was in the middle of all this, and his name was Ahithophel. It seems pretty likely that Ahithophel, even though he was one of David's closest counselors and most highly esteemed, he was a part of this conspiracy. He may have been the one who started it all in the first place, or at least made it what it was at this point, because of the kind of counselor he was. He was slick. He was a politician. He was a thinking man, had a clear head, at least to an extent, and a great compass of thought, although not a great compass of morality, but great compass of thought at least. Nobody even came close to his prowess as an able and famous politician. And so he joined Absalom's rebellion or instigated it. And he was not only that kind of politician, but his counsel is what he was really famous for. And that's where 2 Samuel 16:23 comes into play. Just imagine how big of a compliment it is that the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. What that's saying is his word was like God. They took it as like it was God's word. Like everything that comes out of his mouth is divine, inspired. That's how famous he was for his counsel, political counsel primarily. And that's going to play a huge role in his demise, really, his legacy. One of his problems was he got sucked into the black hole of politics, and he was susceptible to egomania, as is often the case. He really had a big head, it seems. But he was found unfaithful because he was thinking of himself, not of his king, not of David, and certainly not of his God. So after joining Absalom officially, Ahithophel started giving him advice, just like he had done for David. He told him that he needs to take his father's harem, which was an utter shame. But there's probably a reason why he did that. The last thing Ahithophel could afford would be for David and Absalom to be reconciled together. Father, son, having this spat. We know already from our study of Absalom and Amnon and Tamar in that situation, David had a weakness of not doing much about his children. So it seems consistent with his character that he probably would have forgiven Absalom if Absalom wanted forgiveness. Sorry I tried to take your throne, Dad. I'll do better in the future. And he says, okay, yeah, just don't let it happen again. Don't steal my throne again. By the way, he's totally run David out of Jerusalem. David's had to flee Jerusalem. He didn't have to. He did it probably for the sake of the people. Because if David and his men aren't there, they're not going to lay siege to it, which means there's not going to be slaughter in the streets and starvation and whatnot. But for all intents and purposes, Absalom has run David out of the royal city, and he's a fugitive again. It's like Saul all over again. But still, he probably would have been reconciled to him if he had wanted it. So if that happened, the person who's going to be in the most trouble of all will be Ahithophel, because he's the one that betrayed David and took part in this rebellion, probably a very large part. So what would be a way to publicly and absolutely make the feud between them, the breach between them permanent, is if he did this. Take your father's harem. It says, go into your father's concubines. That would have sealed the deal. But then, what really ended up getting him in trouble, or ultimately, he told him, you need to take 120,000 men, go right now, and pursue your dad, and attack them under the cover of darkness, while they're fatigued, distressed, dismayed, discouraged, and unsuspecting. And it'll be yours. I mean, it'll be done. It'll be over. We will win. And at first, everybody said, that's great. You know, this is what we need to do. It's good. After all, Ahithophel's word is from God, pretty much. He's like God speaking. So if that's what he says, then that's probably what we need to do. However, little detail I left out is that David sent one of his trusted other advisors named Hushai back to Jerusalem to pretend like he was on Absalom's side. So this man Hushai goes back and he tricks Absalom into thinking that he's with him. And on this occasion, he wants to know what Hushai has to say. Absalom does. He's heard Ahithophel's counsel. Now he wants to hear Hushai. And Hushai tells him, this is folly. This is disgrace. This will not be good. After all, do you not know what kind of warrior your father is? Haven't you heard the story of David and Goliath, Absalom? Surely you've heard that story before. Haven't you heard about his mighty men? Sure, it sounds great to take these guys on in darkness, but these are David and his mighty men. You don't want to just pick a fight with these guys. And so many other things he said that ended up convincing Absalom that Ahithophel's counsel was not right after all. But there's something behind the scenes going on here. In 2 Samuel 17, verse 14, it says, and Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. Whoops. The rest of that verse says, for Jehovah had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that Jehovah might bring harm upon Absalom. So God was working behind the scenes here. And by the way, in what sense was Ahithophel's counsel good? That verse says, Jehovah had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. Now, he just told him to attack David in the cover of darkness and kill all of them so you can be king. Does that sound like good counsel? As far as the Bible was concerned? So why does it say it was good?
Because it actually was militarily a good scheme.
Yeah.
Because it would have been
It would have succeeded. That's why it was good. The goal in mind would have been achieved if Absalom had done this. So that's why verse 14 of 2 Samuel 17 calls that good counsel. It was good because it would have accomplished what it was intended to accomplish. But God, we're told here, God was working so that Absalom did not do that. So just think about the implications of that, where here is something that goes against God's will, His sovereign will. You know, David said with Saul, I'm not going to raise my hand against God's anointed because that's God's anointed, and if God wants to kill him, He can kill him, but I'm not going to do it. Well, here's a situation where David is in Saul's place, and Absalom is in David's place, in a sense, other than the rebellion, and he has been given a plan that will absolutely positively succeed in killing David, God's anointed, and usurping the throne for good and all, and nobody would be able to deny it. So God says, I'm going to work providentially to make sure that Absalom doesn't take that advice. That's how powerful God's providence can be. No miracles going on here. Again, natural events. But Absalom rejected the counsel of the man who spoke with God's mouth pretty much.
Yeah, but the other guy's counsel was wiser in an ethical.
It was wiser in a spiritual and ethical and moral sense, but it was not correct. I mean,
But I thought maybe it made him kind of wake up and realize, oh, I was doing something.
he made it up. I mean, the things that he said, he was laying it on thick to make Absalom back out of what he decided to do. He said, you know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father's an expert in war. He won't spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he's hidden himself in one of the pits or in some other place, like he's already hiding, waiting. He's just waiting for you to attack. That's what he expects you to do. He's a man of war. He expects you to attack him. He's hiding somewhere right now. He's planting all these thoughts in his mind, like, well, maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea after all to attack them, because, yeah, I didn't think about that. He said, then even the valiant men whose heart's like the heart of a lion will utterly melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father's a mighty man, and that those who are with him are valiant men. But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you. See, and then he takes a different course. He makes Absalom chicken out of attacking his dad and the mighty men. And verse 14 tells us God did that. The reason that Absalom decided that Hushai's counsel was better was because of God's providence. Now, how did God pull that off? I do not know. I don't know how God can make a man think something. But this and other passages that deal with providence would seem to indicate that very thing, that it can get down right to that very thing of the thoughts of a person and their decisions that they make. But this was Ahithophel's counsel that Absalom was rejecting. Well, here's what we read ended up happening. We fast forward then down to verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey, he went off home to his own city, he set his house in order, and hanged himself. And he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. And that's the end of Ahithophel. Verse 24 hops right back into David and Absalom, because it's not about Ahithophel. He just sort of falls into this. But, I mean, that's the legacy of Ahithophel. His life ends just as quickly as his place begins in the narrative. The grandiose life of the wise counselor, who was critically acclaimed as having a divine treasure trove for a mouth, ends in self-centered, self-pitying, self-worshiping disgrace. But I will add this caveat, as despite the fact that verse 23 sounds like it was just a pathetic egotistical pity party. That's not exactly why. He didn't kill himself just because they didn't take his advice. But since his advice was sure to succeed, Absalom's cause would be fulfilled, accomplished. What would that imply about not doing that? What would Hushai's advice result in? David's going to win. See, remember, Hushai is a secret agent. He's a double agent. He's for David. He's on David's side. He's pretending. So he gave this counsel because he knew Absalom would fail if he did this. So Ahithophel's counsel would result in Absalom's success. Hushai's counsel was going to result in David's success, and Ahithophel was smart enough to know that. But he didn't even put up a fight. I guess it was too late. He kills himself because he knows that Absalom's cause is now lost, and if Absalom's cause is lost, his own life is done for. He's a traitor. So he kills himself. Doesn't even try to convince Absalom otherwise. Doesn't even try to seek forgiveness, restitution. Doesn't even try to repent. Even if he's going to be executed formally, officially, he could at least get things right with his own soul. But he didn't. He did what Judas Iscariot did. Just hanged himself instead. So it's a sad story, really. A man, again, here's a man with so many talents and charms, doesn't use them for good, though. Used them for evil. And then whenever his time was up, when his number was called, if you will, he just kills himself without making things right or even trying. So, how about some lessons then? To put faith in mankind or things for salvation or prosperity is utterly vain. That's what Ahaz did. That's what Ahithophel did in a sense. He put faith in himself, probably. Put faith in his own ingenuity, his own skills of convincing people and manipulating people and events. Very much like Absalom, it seems. Hebrews 2:3, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Ahaz, remember, could have called on Jehovah, could have looked to him for help, but instead he went to Assyria. And Assyria got him nothing but nothing. Death and destruction. So, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation is the question that the Hebrews writer asked, referring to Jesus and the salvation that's found in him. If we neglect his salvation, how shall we escape? It's a rhetorical question with a negative answer. We will not escape, is the implication of that rhetorical question. How shall we escape? We shall not. In no other name shall we be saved. Jeremiah 2, have you not brought this upon yourself by forsaking Jehovah your God when he led you in the way? Now what do you gain by going to Egypt? What do you gain by going to Assyria? Nothing and nothing. Jesus once asked, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his own soul? Another rhetorical question. Nothing. He gains nothing. It profits him nothing. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of Jehovah our God. That's a much better resolve than Ahaz had. And number 2, a self-centered defensive mindset is the bane of humility, spiritual soundness, and faithfulness. And that would apply to Ahithophel. Self-centered, for sure. He was defensive. He was anything but humble. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. How many characters and historical examples do we have of men who exalted themselves? It's a very common thing, isn't it? And it manifests itself in a lot of ways.
Just like now, that's what people are doing.
Yeah, exalting of the self. God has told us there's only one result, one ultimate end of self-exaltation, and it's being humbled. You're going to be humbled. It's like, this is going to happen. You can either humble yourself or you can get humbled by God. And let me tell you, you're not going to want to get humbled by God. It's like, you can do it or I can do it. And you don't want me to do it. I'll tell you that. Anybody with an ounce of sense would give that some thought. Don't exalt yourself. Because again, what do you gain by that? Nothing. Nothing good, anyway. Any other thoughts or comments or questions?
Makes you wonder if David, if there's a specific thing that David did to really make Ahithophel angry, or if it was a whole lot of things that, I mean, because he very well could have told Absalom, because, you know, he could have refused Absalom to come to him and have gone to David and
Yeah.
told him, you know, this is what's happening, and advised David still.
Yeah.
Almost had to be pretty angry at David for some reason to
Or maybe he just,
Absalom.
he thought that Absalom's, he just followed the trail of victory. And you know what? He almost made it. I mean, he was smart enough. He was that person that predicted the unexpected, you know, like in gambling or whatever, if there's a team that's just, everybody knows they're going to get demolished, they're going to lose, and if that person bets on that and the odds are like whatever, you know, to whatever odds, and they actually end up winning, and they're like rich now because of that. Ahithophel was the one that was clever enough to know that Absalom was actually had the capacity, and his cause was going to win. He was going to win this. This rebellion was going to succeed against all odds, and he was this close. But the person that he didn't consider was Jehovah. You can't beat Jehovah. He didn't realize, I guess he didn't stop to think he was fighting against Jehovah. And that's the mistake a lot of people make, is in their behaviors and actions and choices, they don't stop to think, I'm actually fighting against God. Wasn't that Gamaliel's advice about Christianity? Arresting the apostles, and he said, look at all these imposters that have popped up. Anytime that they weren't, I mean, everyone has been squashed. If these guys are not from God, they're going to get squashed. If they are from God, then who do you think you are to defeat them? You can't beat them. If they're from God, you can't beat them. Well, Ahithophel didn't stop and think, maybe I'm actually working against God. But he learned, maybe. Right after he died, he probably learned that he was fighting against God that whole time, and that's why it failed. All right, then. Thank you for your comments and attention. What's that?